The Necron race is one of the most powerful factions in all of Warhammer 40K lore. They're up there with the Tyranids, and in today's deep dive video, I want to showcase how badass they are by exploring 5 different battles with 5 different enemies, starting with Chaos, specifically right after the Cicatrice Maledictum was open. After the destruction of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift, warp storms erupted all over the Ultima Segmentum. One in particular unintentionally disrupted a Necron construct known as the Imga Monolith. After spreading across 3 star systems, the warp storm designated as Cerberus was stopped by a perfect sphere of order created by this ancient construct. It didn't take long before the forces of Chaos bled out of the Immaterium and attempted to destroy the Necron monolith. Only the demons of Khorne, who presumably weren't affected by the psyker-canceling effects of the monolith, were able to assault the construct. This conflict became known as the Cerberus Wars, as the Necrons answered with the full military might of the Saltec dynasty. Their warships formed a defensive shield around the monolith as it absorbed the psychic energies from the warp storm and somehow recycled that energy to physically duplicate any Necron warship that made contact with it. This obviously made the Necron force grow massive in size, and the 2 factions battled on every world within 1,400 Terran sols of the monolith. Humanity was forced to join the fight as many of these planets were formerly controlled by the Imperium. Unfortunately, they began to enact exterminatus on the majority of the bordering planets. Now, how powerful the Necron force will become from this conflict is of great concern to the Imperium of Man, but it highlights how prepared the Necrons are in the battle against the forces of Chaos. And yes, this battle really showcases how the Necrons are ready to fight anything that comes out of the Immaterium, but even when it comes to a slumbering tomb world waking up on an Imperial planet, for example, they are ready to attack and destroy. This is the case in this battle with the Death Corps of Krieg.
A young world, Hieronymus Theta, had been preserved for its entire existence from a rampage of war, and was thus ill-prepared when its mutant population emerged from the deeps of its mines to ravage the lower levels of the principal hive city of Hieronymus City. The 42nd, 81st, 103rd, and 186th Death Corps infantry regiments were still inbound when it was revealed that the world of Hieronymus Theta had in fact been established on a dormant Necron tomb world that was slowly awakening. With 4 regiments of the best fighters the Imperial Guard had to offer inbound, authorities tasked the Krieg regiments to cordon off the city and destroy the Necron menace that lay below. The cordon was quickly established, trapping millions of civilians inside Hieronymus City, and at the mercy of the Necrons. Convinced that despite the Necrons' self-repair protocols, the Death Corps would win in a classic war of attrition, the 81st and the 42nd regiments ended up suffering heavy losses, although they still succeeded in holding the line against the overgrowing Necron forces. Losses on the security perimeter were filled by local Planetary Defense Force troops, trained and equipped under the orders of the Death Corps' Watchmaster, whose harsh training regime was the cause of many desertions and subsequent executions. While the Death Corps' commitment could not be questioned, their methods in dealing with their allies gradually envenomed the situation, culminating in the summary execution of Hieronymus Theta's planetary governor and general of the Planetary Defense Force by the 186th Regiment's colonel for having tried to parley with the Necrons. Thanks to the insight of Commissar Castellan attached to the same regiment, a daring raid was mounted against the city's main genitorium, as it was believed that the Necrons were using it to aid in the awakening of their tomb complex. Though the raid was a failure, the attack revealed the location of the Necron Central Command Nexus. The Krieg regiments then converged on it in hopes of annihilating the Nexus with atomic devices, penetrating in full force into Hieronymus City for the first time. The Krieg regiments were slowed down by guerrilla actions of the local population that had turned traitorous and begun venerating the Necrons as iron gods. It was during this parley with one of these groups that the valiant Commissar Castellan, who had survived the raid, was shot. This caused a long enough delay for the Necrons to notice this incursion, and with the loss of nearly all of its heavy artillery forces, the Death Corps regiments withdrew and abandoned the planet to the hands of its new owners.
Now let's take a look at what the Necrons could do to a much tougher faction within 40k, the Orks. At first it's easy to assume that the primitive Orks wouldn't stand a chance against the Necron race. After all, the Orks' preferred weapon of choice is usually a basic choppa, while the Necrons have gauze weaponry that could deatomize a target from a distance. And while the Necron lords might view the greenskins as simple vermin, only a foolish overlord would underestimate the savagery of an Ork walk. If a tomb world is not large enough or not fully awakened, the rampaging Orks would easily overwhelm the Necron lair. And a tomb complex is an amazing prize for an Ork, with technology that can defy the laws of physics and enough resources to triple the size of a warboss's walker army. The Necron's home is a prized jewel for the greenskins. Such was the motivating factor for the Ork warboss Skullcrack, who led a great walk into the desert tomb world of Fortress, on rumors that the planet was home to an ancient alien weaponry. After weeks of searching, all that the Orks had discovered was that Fortress's seas were highly acidic and that its omnipresent sand got everywhere. Yet in truth, Fortress was neither a lifeless nor an uninhabited world, as Skullcrack discovered when the first wave of Necron warriors emerged from the planet's blood-red seas. Brackish water streamed from the living metal bodies. The soulless androids strode across the obsidian sand, each marching in perfect unison with each other, except for those few circuit misfires causing involuntary twitches and stumbles. As quickly as he could, the Ork warboss Skullcrack bellowed out his orders and the Orks prepared for battle. The Necron phalanx came to an abrupt halt, they swung their God's flare to bear, and the killing began. The first volley of energy cut deep into the disordered Orks. Skullcrack, being somewhat quicker-witted than his followers, survived by hoisting up one of the lads off his feet and using him as cover. As a second torrent of energy crackled into the greenskins, Skullcrack threw aside his shield and roared at his boys once more. This time the call of the Wog was taken up across the length and breadth of the shoreline. Choppas flailing, the Orks hurled themselves into the storm of emerald energies. Such a charge would have been sufficient to freeze the blood of any mortal foe, but the Necrons were not so easily shaken as creatures of flesh. 3 more volleys did the mechanical warriors fire, and dozens of greenskins fell to the black sand. But then the Orks were upon them. Skullcrack hurled himself into the Necron ranks, swinging his massive war axe in a succession of brutal alley-crunching arcs that smashed undying heads from their shoulders, crushed rib cages, and shattered limbs. Within moments, the Ork warboss stood alone in a sea of twisted metal. He roared his dominance over the foe. Yet Skullcrack's claim to victory was premature. Even as the last Necron fell, the regeneration circuits of the first triggered, drawing upon hidden power reserves into the limbs and returning the warriors to full function. Even before Skullcrack's shout had finished echoing off the cliff, the Ork warboss found himself surrounded once again by the reanimated forms of those he had just hacked apart only moments before. Such was the scene all across the shore. Again and again, the Orks' ferocity bore Necron warriors to the ground, but again and again the fallen dragged themselves back up into the fight. Decapitated heads were reclaimed by grasping hands, and severed arms scrambled across the sand in search for sundered necrodermis bodies. As the momentum of the Ork charge faded, the Necrons began to hold their own in the bitter battle. Still acting in unison, the Necron warriors hacked at the Orks with heavy-bladed bayonets, and unlike their opponents, the greenskins that were struck down did not rise again. Only near Skullcrack was the fight still in the Orks' favor, for the warboss had taken to smashing his opponent into as many and as small pieces as possible to delay the inevitable reassembly. So lost was he in the joy of battle that Skullcrack didn't notice the swiftly rising tide until the waters were lapping at his feet. The dynamic of the battle had changed as the sea rose up to the beach to swallow the sands. For the first time since the fight had begun, downed Necrons were failing to regenerate, as vital components were swept out into the seething waters of the bay. Yet the rising tide also sucked at the Orks' feet, making their footing treacherous. Worse still, those Necrons that managed to self-repair did so hidden beneath the waves, and many an Ork were dragged beneath the surface by grasping mechanical hands. Bellowing at his lads to follow, the warboss ran back to the beach as swiftly as the drag of water about his leg would allow him. There, under the shadow of the cliff face, the Orks prepared to make their stand. The waters below were quieter now. Only a handful of Necrons were visible above the water, and then suddenly they were sucked beneath the surface. The greenskins let out a cheer, but the noise swiftly died away, as out in the bay the waters parted once more and a slab-sided monolith heaved its way to the surface. Gunfire scattering off its armored flank, the war machine glided slowly towards Skullcrack and his remaining boys. There was an ear-splitting whine. The crystal atop the monolith glowed a piercing white, and then all that was left of the Orks was a smoldering pile of ash. Far beneath the surface of the bay in a vaulted stone chamber, 2 enthroned Necron nobles watched the holographic reaction of Skullcrack's demise. Rising, one banished the hologram with a dissatisfied wave of his metallic hand.
Combat efficiency remains at 70% of acceptable parameters. Further data is necessary to complete the required optimization.
Indeed, replied the other, also rising.
Recommend activation of Mind Shackle Scarabs XD11101. Humans will provide a suitable comparator.
The first Necron nodded to indicate his agreement and issued the necessary command.
It is done. If the subject performs as expected, we have 3 solar months to prepare.
Shortly thereafter, 3 sectors away, Tech Priest Drudak began preparation to investigate a report cache of xenotechnology. It was located in an out-of-the-way desert world known as Fortress. Now we can gather from this information that the Necrons were setting up the Orks. They knew that the Orks were coming and they wanted to test out new weapons on the Greenskins. However, the same cannot be said for another notable encounter between the Necrons and the Orks. When attempting to loot the ancient treasures of the Necron tomb world, Deathskull warlord Zork triggered a planetary reanimation protocol. Canoptic constructs by the thousands surrounded the Greenskin invaders, but far from being intimidated, the Deathskulls were delighted. They scavenged and stole at will. The Orks cobbled together hordes of cyborgs, Morkanauts, and ever more improbable superweapons. While using a hijacked Necron Dolmen Gate, they ferried in waves upon waves of reinforcements. By the time the Tomb World's overlord Thamtek the Magnificent awakened to take command of his legions, he did so at the side of a mob of leering mech boys standing over his sarcophagus. The Orks completely destroyed the Tomb World. Now let's move back to humanity and see how the Necrons would handle the strongest warriors, the Space Marines.
The Necron Lord, Nemesor Nandrak, gave the Imperial Defenders of Ut Prime 1 solar month to withdraw, as was required by ancient Necron codes of battle. Yet when the deadline had passed, the foolish humans had not taken advantage of this most generous offer, for the Necron fleet held itself in orbit around Ut Prime's desert moon. 4 regiments of the Imperial Guard's Catachan jungle fighters and 3 companies of Imperial Fist Space Marines had come to reinforce the contested world. So when the Necron Lord finally launched his assault, he did so against a planet with formidable defenders. However, when his courtiers argued against protracting the war to its completion, the Nemesor merely issued a grating laugh. In the beginning of the war, the Necron Lord ignored Ut Prime's outlying cities, focusing his assault on Fort Ann, the planetary capital. His first attack wave was a dozen squadrons of Doomscythe fighter craft. They swarmed over Fort Ann's fortification, death rays, raising great furrows of twisted metal and stone as they plowed through bastions, ferrocrete walls, and luckless human defenders therein. To their credit, the humans put up a spiritual resistance. Hydra-flanked tanks and defense lasers scoured the skies, driving off or blasting apart many of the swarming Necron aircraft. Yet each time a Doomscythe was destroyed, another immediately peeled off from the main group to exact vengeance. Soon, Fort Ann was stripped of aerial defenses, and the landing began. Transport craft followed in the wake of the first attack. Night sights flew low over the wreckage of crashed Necron flyers and Imperial bastions. Small arms fire scattered across the Night Sight's armored hull, as their flickering teleportation invasion beams delivered the Necron's assault troops into the heart of the human defenses. Phalanx upon phalanx of immortals and Necron warriors stalked through the fresh ruins, Gauss weapons blazing in unnaturally piercing volleys as they drove the Catachans back. Here and there, an officer sparked orders held the guardsmen in line, but where those commanders fell, the Imperial line went into full retreat. It was as the attackers' lines reached the planetary governor's citadel that the Imperial Fist finally made their presence known. Thunderhawk gunships screamed through the skies, shredding the oncoming Necron warriors with heavy bolter fire and blasting immortal limb from limb with missile strikes. As the gunships touched down amongst the rubble to disgorge Space Marines into the fray, the Necrons shifted to the defense protocol and awaited reinforcement. Alas for the Imperial Fists, from a vantage point in orbit, the Lord had marked the approach of the Thunderhawks long before they had made their presence known. Thus, even as the roar of bolter fire echoed through Fort Ann's ruins, a shadow fell over the battlefield as the massive Necron megalith descended. The megalith was no ordinary war engine, but a vast floating fortress. Green fire lanced out from its flanks, blasting Thunderhawks from the air or crippling them to the ground. As the shadow grew larger, chunks of the megalith's understructure broke away, the blocks falling lazily to the ground. They were no mere wreckages, but monoliths detaching from the mothership's hull. As each touched down, it added firepower to the barrage assailing the Imperial Fists. The Space Marines must have known that they were doomed, but duty and stubborn tenacity made them redouble their efforts. Las cannon and multi-melt of fire flickered through the ruins, the beams converging to pierce the monolith's necrodermis hulls. Assault squads threw themselves at the Necron phalanxes, chainsword teeth screaming as they ripped through living metal bodies. However, the megalith was now close enough to the ground to bring its invasion beam into play. Ghoulish viridian lights flickered over the battlefield as the teleport beam activated, delivering doomsday arcs, legions of Necron immortals, as well as the Lord and his personal Lich Guard into the thick of battle. Those Space Marines that yet survived now withdrew to the planetary governor's citadel, but 3 doomsday arcs converged their fire to the great adamantium gate. For a handful of moments, it glowed an angry red, then burst into fragments with an ear-splitting crack. As the Imperial fist fell back deeper into the citadel, the Lord raised his war scythes in salute to the doomed foes. Then the scythe went down, and the Nemesaur led his triumphant army of the Undying through the ruined gates. Shortly thereafter, Fort Anne had fallen. The rest of Ood Prime would soon follow, and another world would be added to the territory of Gidrim, and the growing personal domain of Nemesaur Zandrak. The Space Marines would continue their struggle against the Necrons, this time in the Orpheus sector, in the edge of the Segmentum Tempestus, when the Minarch dynasty reached its intended strength, attacking the Imperial sector. The attack was preceded by a communication blackout, which left the Orpheus sector cut in two. The Necrons advanced in 2 distinct lines of battle, one invading the sector from the outer darkness, with a second line entering the sector from the galactic south and the territories of their former Layak sector. Unable to call for help, the entire eastern half of the Orpheus sector succumbed quickly, with only the Space Marines of the Angel's Revenant chapter putting up a true fight. But even their sacrifice was not enough to stop the Xeno advance. 100 solar days after the Minarch offensive began, the silence was broken, and a tide of atmospheric warnings and distress signals reached the Orpheus sector's capital world of Amarra Prime. Only now realizing that it had come under attack, the Imperium mobilized its vast armies. Unfortunately, it could not prevent the Drusilian subsector from being overrun, led by their greatest Nemesaur, Macklin Kutlak. The Necrons inexplicably stopped their advance after 100 solar days. As tradition demanded it, their enemy would be given 2 cycles of the ancient Necron-tier moon to prepare themselves to meet their death. The Orpheus sector's Imperial governor, Calibor Lan, used this time to turn his world, Amarra Prime, into a fortress, stripping other worlds of their defenses and transferring them to Amarra. Crusading forces and reinforcements allotted to the purge of the chaos-ridden Chimerium system were rerouted to Amarra, including the armies drawn from the Necromundan regiments and the fearsome Death Corps of Krieg of the Imperial Guard. Most importantly, perhaps, the entire Space Marine chapter, the Minotaurs, under their chapter master, Asterion Moloch, joined the defenders of Amarra. And yet, this stronghold of Imperial might was laid low in a single solar day, when the Necrons almost entirely destroyed the powerful battle fleet defending Amarra, and landed their troops unopposed on the surface. Had it not been for the desperate counterattack of the Minotaur's chapter fleet, and the stoic resistance of the Death Corps, total victory would have been achieved. Yet through great sacrifice and bloody determination, Moloch faced Kutlak on the bridge of his tomb ship, Dead Hand. The Minotaur's chapter master and his elite First Company veterans succeeded in wounding Kutlak before being sucked into the void. Having not anticipated this level of stubbornness amongst their foes, the Necrons retreated with something akin to respect for the vermin which had settled upon their world. For the Imperium, however, the losses of the Battle of Amarra proved so severe that the sector had to be abandoned and officially dissolved as a Sector Imperialis. The fighting continued, however, as the Undying Legions progressed to the Galactic West, and the Imperium tried to salvage what it could from the remains of the Orpheus sector. The Space Marines would get their revenge on the Necrons on the mining world of Domnos in the Ultima Segmentum. A Necron tomb world was discovered on the city of Mandos Prime when a fusion station was under repair following severe seismic activity. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests rapidly claimed the rights to the Xeno artifacts and extradited several specimens to the nearby Forge world. Soon after, under a wave of atmospheric interference that clouded the entire northern hemisphere of the planet, the Necrons emerged from their tombs. The planet went on alert, but the threat was incomprehensible. No warning had been received from the fallen hive cities, and any reconnaissance units deployed never returned. As more hive cities toppled to the unknown invaders, word of the assault finally got through to the planetary governor, who deployed every regiment under his command. Within 6 solar months, Almost all of Domno's Manufactorum hive cities were in ruin, and the planetary capital of Kellenport finally fell to the Necron forces. The second company of the Ultramarines answered the planet's distress call. The strike cruiser, Valen's Revenge, arrived just as the final Necron assault on the world's capital city of Kellenport began. Aboard was Captain Cato Sicarius, who ordered the cruiser to move into low orbit above Kellenport to begin the ground assault. The second company launched in 3 groups of drop pods. The first, with Captain Sicarius, struck the Necron forces in the very heart of their siege lines, scouring the machine warriors from the capital city's outer walls. The second group of the Ultramarines, under the command of Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius, hit home amidst the Necron Gauss cannons and Gauss pylons, whose fire was raining down upon the remaining Imperial defenders of the capital. And the third wave of Ultramarines, consisting entirely of unmanned Deathwing drop pods, slammed into the broken rubble outside the besieged capital, firing waves of missiles into the Necron flanks. The first strike force advanced against the Necron command node. Their target was the Necron Lord commanding the assault. Captain Sicarius assaulted his position with his most experienced battle brothers and the dreadnought Agrippan. Sicarius was badly wounded in the assault, and for a moment it looked like the Necrons would earn the victory. But the dreadnought attacked the Necron Lord, and with a single blow he destroyed the nefarious enemy commander. With their leader, the only true sentient Necron, destroyed, the Necrons reverted to their secondary command protocols and began to retreat. Captain Sicarius was taken to the strike cruiser's medical bay, and Tigurius took command over the remaining Ultramarines. Later, Tigurius and Agrippan were forced to acknowledge that Domnos was lost to the enemy. They initiated an evacuation of as many of the planet's inhabitants as possible. When the new Necron assault began, most of the planet's inhabitants were already gone, and only the Ultramarines and the Kellenport-based regiments of the Astra Militarum were still on the ground. The Ultramarines defended the city valiantly, slowly falling back to the spaceport as the last Thunderhawk gunship landed to evacuate the survivors. Only 40 Space Marines and 20 Guardsmen were still alive. In the final moments of the battle, the dreadnought Agrippan fell, pinned down between a dozen streams of Gauss cannon fire. As the Thunderhawks sped Tigurius and the last of the Imperial defenders to the safety of Valen's Revenge, Agrippan's internal plasma reactor went critical, and the resulting explosion destroyed Damnal's capital city and every Necron within it. Later, Damnals was bombarded by the vessels of the Imperial Navy from orbit, destroying the planet's surface and ending the Necron threat on Damnos, at least as far as the Imperium was aware. Since Sicarius and his men were able to evacuate large swaths of the world's population from certain death, the mission was not a complete failure. However, the Ultramarines failed in their primary objective of destroying the Necron threat that had emerged on Damnos. Sicarius was determined not to let such a slight go unanswered for so long. For the first time, he had tasted bitter defeat in battle, and it was a black mark that would twist within his heart for the next 25 standard years. In future battles, the violent displays of courage became reckless to the point of unnecessarily endangering the lives of his men, and every victory after Damnos rang hollow to him. Despite the Inquisition's effort to suppress all knowledge of the Necrons' reemergence into the galaxy, the Imperium's faith in its military supremacy was shaken by the news that spread across the galaxy, and that the Xenos had overcome both the Imperial Guard and the Ultramarines at Damnos. Eventually, reports of the loss of Damnos made their way to Terra, where both the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the High Lords of Terra decreed that the Ultramarines must return to Damnos and eradicate the Necron threat once and for all. 25 standard years after the Damnos incident, this Imperial order was brought to Macrack by the experienced Deathwatch strike team led by Squad Lazarius. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar was not pleased with the Imperial decree, for he knew that the Second Company had faced only a fraction of the awakened Necrons on Damnos, a quarter of a Terran century before. Once they returned to Damnos, the Ultramarines would face the entire strength of a Necron tomb world, and risk the deaths of hundreds of the chapter's Astartes. The journey to Damnos was a perilous one, with Calgar relying on various ruses and distractions to get his warriors safely to the planet's surface. By the time the Necrons had spotted the true location of the Ultramarines' warship, the Astartes fleet was in position to launch their drop pods. The first wave consisted of unmanned variant designs to draw the fire of the Gauss pylon. The second wave, however, represented the true assault, which brought hundreds of Space Marines, as well as a number of vengeful Imperial Guard regiments, to the heart of the Necrons' subterranean tomb complexes. Their objective was to destroy the pyramid complex that controlled the Necrons' power grid, and to do it before the Imperial forces were overwhelmed. However, one factor that they did not account for was the physical incarnation of the Catan held within the Tesseract Vault. It was determined that this vault was the true source of the Necrons' power, and must be neutralized if the Imperial forces were to have any hope of victory. Despite the power brought to bear by the Imperial assault on Damnos, Marnia's Calgar felt like a duelist being taken apart by a superior foe in the battle cage. The Xenos' battle logic proven impeccable, with its master intelligence anticipating the Ultramarines' every move and neutralizing each tactic they employed. Thanks to an energy shield emitted from the vault, every plasma volley and meltablast employed against the Necron monoliths dissipated harmlessly or detonated prematurely before it could harm the construct. Since the Xenos had managed to analyze the Ultramarines' battle doctrines, Calgar realized he must attempt a completely unexpected stratagem. Assaulting the ranks of the Necron Immortals, the Chapter Master jumped onto the metallic base of the malfunctioning gauze pylon and slowly pushed the war engine's crest back until the Viridian beam hit the energy shield of the floating necropolis. With a blinding flash of light, the energy shield protecting the tomb complex collapsed, and the Tesseract vault was broken wide open to reveal the enraged demigod imprisoned within. A giant cruciform of pure light rose above the Necron army, the remnants of the Catan's energy cage still crackling around it, roaring in joy at its newfound freedom. The booming sound threw Ultramarines and Necrons alike to the icy ground and cracked the planet's crust. Its first victim would be the Necron Overlord, the Undying, which the Star God crushed with ease by transforming the earth around his metallic form into an oversized fist. The Overlord phased out of reality, seeking to escape back to his subterranean lair, but deep underground, the surviving members of Deathwatch Squad, Lazarius, had reached their own objective. The Undying teleported back to his cable sarcophagus, right in front of the Deathwatch's eyes. Unfortunately for the Necron, the crack team of Astartes had replaced the engines with melta-charges and destabilizers, and proceeded to blast the Necron Overlord into atoms. Back on the surface, the Xenos reeled from the loss of their leader, the artificially intelligent command program that governed their warriors' every action. Meanwhile, the Unleashed Catan lashed out in fury at both the Necron enslavers and the Ultramarines as Captain Sicarius dueled the Flayed One Lord. After ramming his power sword into the powerful Flayed One's torso, Sicarius summoned 25 Terran years of anger and frustration to the final burst of strength. He unclipped the vortex grenade that had been given to him earlier and activated its weapon before throwing it at the enraged demigod hovering overhead. The grenade detonated and formed a spiraling orb of nothingness as its unstoppable force sucked the Catan into the warp before collapsing and winking out of existence. Sicarius felt a great weight lift in that moment as he realized both he and the Ultramarines had been redeemed for their original failure on Damnos in the sight of the Emperor. Over the next few solar days, the Imperials eliminated the surviving Necrons with grim efficiency. Empty tomb complexes were collapsed or detonated under the guidance of the Deathwatch, and the citizens of Damnos, whom Sicarius had rescued solar decades before, were restored to the world to reclaim it for their own.
And finally, let's take a look at a classic battle between the Necrons and their mortal enemies, not the old ones, the Eldar.
If you guys find this interesting. But with that said, let's get into 40 facts on the Siege of Somor. The Siege of Somor was a military campaign fought by the Eldar of Craftworld Alitok against the Necrons of the newly emerged Celtic dynasty on the tomb world of Somor. When the Eldar Farseer, Eldrath Starbane, led his war host to the tomb world of Somor, he expected to face a Necron tomb disoriented from its long sleep of 60 million standard years. Yet such a simple battle was not to be. The Pharaon Imhotep, the Stormlord, had come to Somor, seeking to bend its overlord to his will and the service of the Celtic dynasty. The arrival of the Eldar had sped the negotiations in Imhotep's favor, for Somor could not stand against this ancient enemy of the Necrons alone. The Tomb World stasis crypts had been ill prepared for the Great Sleep, and many thousands of its Necron warriors had passed into dust. Those that had survived were rising slowly and irregularly. Somonor's overlord, Sauron, had little hesitation in pledging allegiance to the growing Celtic dynasty, for the alternative was to see his domain destroyed at Starbane's hands. With the pact sealed, Imhotep's priority swiftly turned to battle, a battle that would have to be won through cunning as much as force of arms. When Starbane led his advanced forces to the chill cadre that concealed the tomb's entrance, he found it held against him. Confident of victory, the Farseer launched his attack without waiting for the rest of the host. It was a mistake that would cost the Eldar dearly. For every advance the Eldar made, Imhotep had prepared a counter. Nowhere was this more clearly seen than when the Wave Serpent and its Viper Squadron escort split off from the main Eldar assault and drove hard towards the battle's heart. Their goal? To assail Imhotep directly. Yet Imhotep had expected such a move. Indeed, he had left certain sectors of his defense enticingly weak to provoke such an attempt. As the Vipers closed into killing range, there was a blinding flash of emerald light, and the immovable bulk of a monolith materialized between the Eldar and their prey. Unable to pull up in time, the lead Viper slammed full tilt into the slab-side Necron war vessel, the resulting fireball leaving not so much as a scorch mark on the monolith's living metal hull. Saved by a split-second warning and their pilot's unnatural reflexes, the other Vipers broke formation and banked hard, swarming about the monolith's flanks like angry insects as they brought their weapons to bear on the new target. Yet the damage had already been done, and with the Viper's screen disrupted, the monolith was free to bring its particle whip, a devastating Necron weapon that emits a stream of minuscule antimatter particles which detonate on contact with other matter, to bear on the Eldar. This it did with a pinpoint accuracy, the first blast reducing the grav tank to a shattered hull, and the second obliterating the handful of aspect warriors who crawled from the burning wreckage. At every turn, Imhotep sought to deny the Eldar their most important tactical advantage, maneuverability. Deathmarks sniped jetbikers from their saddles. Flotillas of heavy destroyers, positioned about the rim of the caldera, targeted falcons and fire prisms with volley after volley of crackling gauze weapon fire, punching through holes and disabling anti-gravity units. By the time Starbane realized the severity of the threat he faced, his force was incapable of retreat and had no choice but to press on. Yet Imhotep's methodical countermeasures could only hold back the Eldar for so long. For every crippled Necron that reassembled itself and rejoined the firing line, another succumbed to critical damage and was whisked away by retrieval teleporters. Little by little, the Stormlord's forces wore thin. The monolith was destroyed in a bold assault by Fire Dragon aspect warriors, the Deathmarks eliminated by Pathfinders, and the Destroyers were scoured from their perch by Dark Reapers. And still the Eldar came on. The main body of the host had arrived and were massing for a second attack. Imhotep knew that his remaining forces could not hold against this new wave of attackers, but then again, it had never been the plan to do so. Summoning angry storm clouds to cover his retreat, Imhotep unsealed the great stone entrance and led his dwindling army into the darkness of the tomb. Had Starbane been less arrogant, less certain of his superiority and that of his race, he might have recognized the trap for what it was and withdrawn. Yet the Farseer cast his runes in haste and saw only victory ahead, and so he missed the subtle warnings hidden amongst the web of fate and the flow of the Immaterium. Long did the Eldar walk in darkness, through dusty vaults and chambers that had not been seen by the living for millions of Terran years. Though they caught sight of many technological wonders, the intruders caught not so much a glimpse of the Necrons they pursued, nor the tomb's robotic servitors. The deeper Starbane progressed into the tomb without any contact, the more he grew convinced that the enemy had simply fled, escaping into the subterranean labyrinth in order to fight another day. Deeper and deeper into the tomb the Eldar went, until, in a colossal vault chamber many miles beneath the surface, Imhotep sprang his trap. Without warning, quantum gravitic force fields flickered into life as the chamber's exits sealed the Eldar within. As his followers turned their weapons onto the force field, Starbane could just make out the figure of Imhotep through the shimmering barrier of gravitic force, the Pharaon standing mute and proud at the head of the phalanx of immortals. Starbane saw the Stormlord raise one clenched metallic fist in salute, and the buzzing began. It started as a low drone that rumbled through the stone floor, rising in volume and intensity until it drowned out any other sound. As the noise reached fever pitch, swirling clouds of blood-red nanoscarabs burst from concealed vents. They swarmed about the intruders, probing armor for any crack that would allow ingress, then burrowing into the warm flesh beneath. Then, as soon as it had begun, the buzzing ceased, the swarm of nanoscarabs dissipated. The flagstones of the chamber were slick with Eldar blood, and the air thick with the screams of the wounded. But Starbane was grimly triumphant. Imhotep's trap had been sprung, but the Eldar had endured it. The Farseer looked beyond the force field, a challenge in his eyes as he met Imhotep's gaze once again. In reply, the Stormlord tilted his head slightly to one side. Though his expression was incapable of change, there was something distinctly mocking in his aspect. Then the Flayed Ones attacked, dropping out of the darkness, their mad voices keening with bloodlust as their razor-sharp claws slashed and tore at the intruders. In the face of this new threat, the quantum shields were swiftly forgotten. The Eldar gathered in knots of warriors who fought back to back against these attackers. It was impossible to say how long the creatures had lurked in the shadows, clutching to the vaulted ceilings. Perhaps they had been there before the Eldar had entered the chamber. Perhaps they had been drawn by the blood-swarm scarabs. It mattered little. Initially, the Flayed Ones created great carnage, isolating individual guardians and aspect warriors from their fellows, and tearing them limb from shrieking limb. Yet as the Eldar resistance grew less panicked, and the defensive ring grew even tighter, the tide began to turn. The Flayed Ones attacked again and again, only to be hurled back by the disciplined shuriken fire of guardians and aspect warriors, who fought shoulder to shoulder and back to back. The Flayed Ones attacked once, twice, 3 times more, then circled their prey, searching for an opening. It was only when the Flayed Ones stalled their attack that Imhotep unleashed the final phase of his trap. With a gesture, the Stormlord negated the force field that stood before him, and ordered his undying minions into the fray. The Immortals advanced, firing indiscriminately as they came, uncaring as to whether hitting the Eldar or the Flayed Ones. For their part, the Flayed Ones were able to escape the threat, twisting aside and melting into the shadows as swiftly as they had come. For the Eldar gathered in the tight formations to better defend against the melee attacks of the Flayed Ones. The onslaught was devastating. Nearly half their numbers fell in the first volley, and those that survived were so disoriented that their counterattack did little to stay the implacable Necron advance. By the time Imhotep led a shield wall of Lynchguard into the chamber, the outcome of the battle was no longer in doubt. Of the Eldar warriors who had entered the tomb, only one survived to bring news of the defeat to the craftworld Alatok. In the Chamber of Eternal Starlight, Starbane stood before the craftworld Seer Council and recounted the slaughter in the catacombs. The Farseer told of how Imhotep had spared him, while all other captives had been swiftly put to death. He told how the Stormlord had severed his right hand to serve as a humiliating reminder of the defeat, and then set him loose. Starbane's words brought great dismay, and the council turned swiftly to plans of vengeance. Their new strike would not fall against Somor, but at the very heart of the Sautek dynasty itself.
And those are 5 battles that took place that showcased the Necrons' readiness for combat. I hope you guys enjoyed. More Necron lore videos to come. I've been covering them a lot lately. But subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment down in the comment section below. Let me know what else you want to see. This was Gershwin with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.
Always used to put my freedom first in any